If you're watching this, you've got at least some level of interest in the Regents Physics question project, and I appreciate that. What I want to do here is a couple things. I want to give you an update on where the project is at now. It's doing very well. We have 136 contributors right now, or at least people signed up. Using the database has changed slightly, but there's some important changes. I'll highlight that briefly. The biggest question I've been getting from people is that they really want to help out, but they don't have Examview, or they've got an old version. And I want to let you know that I've worked through that, and that's really no problem. You can help us out a huge deal by initially entering an exam as something called a rich text format file. Once it's in that version, it's not such a good idea to edit from there, but I'll go over that. And then I want to talk about what's next for the project in terms of categorizing the questions and where we go from here. I'm going to put captions on YouTube that link to these 4 topics, so they'll make it a little easier to follow. As far as the overall project, this is the website. It has changed and will continue to change slightly. The most important part is right here, the database, and I've changed the look of that a little bit so it's a little bit more concise. I like to sort it by exam. There are 50 exams numbered, as you know. People contribute an exam, or say they're going to contribute an exam, and they're going to upload the file. It'll show here. This link should be the most recent version of the Examview file, though that relies on the user to upload it twice, and I'll explain how that works. To get the skinny on any one exam, what you'll want to do is you'll actually want to click on this pencil icon. That's the edit icon, and you can see the most recent file, which should be the same as the most recent version. I've made spots for 10 versions, but it could really be any number. And it's going to be important that people go ahead, even if you're not the one who contributed to the exam, go ahead, open it up, see if there are any mistakes, anything like that, and you can re-upload it as a second version and then just upload it again here. And by doing that, we'll keep it current, keep the version straight, and I think people are more willing to do that when they know how it works. So that's the change to the database. The other area that we need people to help out with is actually in the forum, and in particular, how do we want to categorize these questions? That's a really important topic, and I'll talk more about that in next steps. So going back to here, the biggest question we get is, how do you work with it if you don't have Examview? And taking an exam, as you know, can be 120 questions long, or the more recent ones are more like 50, but it's a lot of work to enter it. And whether you do that in Examview or whether you do that as something called a rich text format file, it's basically like a generic Word file. That's hugely helpful because I, or people I train, can take this file and turn it into this file. And let's go ahead and talk about some of the details involved there, and I will show you what that looks like. So if you store it as a .bnk file and an Examview file, that's the desired format. That's the way these things are going to stay at, until later steps, unless it's the first time you're uploading an exam. Then it can go ahead and be an RTF issue file. And I want to show you, I'm using 6.x. It seems like most people have this. I know there's a newer one. I know there's some older ones. But this is, for now, the preferred version. But use whatever you've got, and we'll get it there. The one downside when you convert to an RTF file, and we will do this for all the exams so people can access it that way too, is that those things called narratives don't bind to the questions by default. So to show you what I mean, if I was to open up the bank file for exam 12, this is the one I did, you can see if you look at questions 61 to 65, for example, this bit of text in this graph actually goes with all of them. This is what's known in Examview as a narrative. Narratives can be tied to questions. So this narrative you can edit. We gave it a name here, 1980, 61 to 66. And when you click on questions 61 through 66, you'll see in this narrative field they've all got that. That ties this to this question. Same thing's going to go for 62, 63, 64, etc. That's an important piece that really needs to be done. Now, unfortunately, when you export, to an RTF file is how it exports. And if I go to that same question, 61, it actually doesn't export tied to these questions, which isn't that big a deal if it's just for export, but it then makes it harder to go back into an Examview bank. So for that reason, if you want to initially upload an exam as an RTF, because it's all you can do, that's great. That gets us 90% of the way there for an exam. But once it is in this format and we import it into bank format, I just ask that we don't do that again. Some other issues that we want to know about are that the equations turn out to look not quite as nice in the RTF format because they're images of the equation rather than having the equation editor. So to highlight this difference, let me show you. So for example, if I was to look at question 30, and I'll pull it up first in Examview so that you can see. Question 30 has a formula, f over 2. If you were to look at this, I can actually click on this. There's an equation editor. It's a lot cleaner looking. Look what happens when I look at the exported version. When I look at the exported version of question 30, this doesn't look quite as nice because it's converted that equation into an image. Similarly, if I then re-import it like I did here, just to highlight the difference, and I go to question 30, it then re-imports as this sort of sloppier image. And that's not really ideal, so to avoid that, we're going to ask that once an exam is in Examview, it's no longer edited out of an RTF version. So those are some known issues. The equations don't look great. The narratives don't get tied to it. And the other thing, when you export to, or when you import from the RTF, if you have questions such as, let me look at question 43 in this exam. Let me pause. Anytime you have choices that are A, B, C, or D, notice that's the same as the way you indicate choices. That causes a problem on re-import. It's not that big a deal, you just have to manually change it. But let me show you what it looks like if I were to import that into here and I was to look at that same question 43. It looks kind of funky because it thought this A was a choice A, and it just kind of messes things up a little bit. It only affects a small number of questions, and especially if you note it in the comments section, somebody that does have Examview can go ahead and take care of it, such as myself. But those are the reasons for starting off in Examview if you can. If not, doing it as an RTF is hugely advantageous because it does get it most of the way there when we re-import it. How do you... what should you do when you're starting off with it in an RTF format? There's really just one or two things I'd like you to keep in mind and a tag you've got to end. First of all, just leave it in Times New Roman font 11. The second thing is you can actually tell it where the narratives are, and that will make it a lot easier on somebody like myself importing it. And all you have to do is... Sorry for the delay here. This is the same thing I just went over, the issues importing into a bank from an RTF. The tags have to be entered, which I'm about to show you. The single character choices don't import correctly when they're A, B, C, D. And the way you actually should handle an RTF file with those narratives is you have to add some tags. And it's actually pretty straightforward. Now, it doesn't have to be colored, but I did that to highlight it. So here's the narrative you would have in your RTF, the text, the image, the images, however it may be. You need to type this exactly in blue. ne'er begin. Then you need to give it some sort of name. The name isn't really critical as long as it's the same as the name you use when you actually tie it to a question. So I like to name it with the question numbers that are affected, but you can name it whatever you want. You can name it Bob, Sally, the moon. Notice the purple here matches the purple here, and this does have to be exactly capital N-A-R colon and then that, and this does have to be exactly ne'er begin colon. So just make sure you do that for the questions, such as I did here. When I import this, we still have the same issues with letter choices and number choices and equations not being editable, but you can at least make the narratives tie to the questions, and that'll be hugely helpful, because if you don't put this in, what's going to happen is when you look at the imported version, and I go back to question 60, or 61 rather, notice there's no narrative. It never imported because it never saw those tags, and similarly, when you look at the question, there's no narrative here. That's a drawback that's relatively minor compared to the very thankfulness of the rest of us if you're willing to type some of these questions in as .rtf files. Let me just show you where to get an RTF file to base it off of. What you're going to do is you just go to this, the site, the course site, and you scroll down to the example. Here's an example that's an RTF. That's this file that you see here, and you're just going to basically overwrite the questions that I have here. You're just going to delete this, put in your question, your answer, etc. It still takes just as much time. I don't think it takes any more time than using Examview, but that's hugely helpful, and would really, really appreciate it if you take the time to do that. Now, as far as where we're heading here, well, that depends a little bit. Let me just blow this up so it's a little easier to read. We want to finish entering the exams. We're about 20% of the way there. We've got quality control, which is just checking for typos, making sure it's the correct answer, making sure the narratives match, things like that. And that's why I left a lot of versions in the database. We can add as many as we need. So feel free to go through those Examview banks, make any changes, and just upload as a new version. We've got to choose categories, so you're going to want to go to the forum. And when we choose those categories, we've got to be really careful. We've got to make sure that we have our act together before we go ahead doing these other things, because to make changes after it's already been propagated is really difficult. Do we want to use the current New York State standards? Those don't cover all the questions. For example, electricity and magnetism, thermo from the older ones. Do we make our own categories, things that just make sense to us as physics teachers? Do we use other ones? Do you want to categorize for difficulty level? Do you want to mark ones that are appropriate for AP? Those are things we need to talk about. Those are going to be categorized in Examview. I have some thoughts about that. Maybe just using numbers for categories initially, but we can talk about that. Then I'm going to, maybe with some help, this step actually is relatively easy compared to the act of entering the exams, which is exporting to Blackboard and Moodle. And exporting to RTF, so people want to access it that way. Then there's the question of, do we want to package this all up nicely for people as Blackboard, as Moodle, as Examview banks, by category? That's not that bad to do. I'd certainly be willing to do that. And then beyond this, what if we want to go beyond the Regents exam? Do people want to do it for existing AP questions? Maybe there's some issues with that. Do people want to do it for AP-like questions that they've made? What about teacher-generated multiple choice? How about randomly generated questions? Sort of like, I've never used one of these services. There's the one that Texas does, WebAssign, things like that. And what do you want to see? There's a lot of really smart people around here that are definitely willing to lend their time. I can't tell you how many people check the site on a regular basis here. I think they're just waiting for it to get far enough along, or they just don't see how they can help. But for the right project, people are generally willing to help out, and I think a lot of good can come of this. I tried to keep this as short as I can. Please feel free to email me if you have any questions. And thanks for helping out, and thanks for being interested.